1 million. This is not just a number, this is the mathematical expression of an apocalypse. According to data from the Ukrainian General Staff, more than 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or disabled since the start of the war. This is an unprecedented loss of life in modern warfare. While the Kremlin's propaganda machine dismisses these figures as lies, Western intelligence agencies and leaked Pentagon documents confirm that the true toll is horrifyingly close to these numbers. But the darkest, most secret and most brutal part of this story is not who these 1 million people are, but where they come from. The overwhelming majority of these losses did not come from the bright lights of Moscow or the luxurious streets of St. Petersburg. They came from the forgotten, abandoned and exploited heart of Russia, from Siberia, from Buryatia, Tuva, Yakutia, from the poorest, most remote and most neglected regions of the Russian Federation. The Kremlin is financing its war in Ukraine by systematically sending the most vulnerable and loyal subjects of its own empire to the slaughterhouse. This is not a war. This is an ethnic cleansing campaign Putin is waging against his own people. And now, after 3 years of suffering and betrayal, Siberia's patience is running out. The cries of mothers, the silence of abandoned villages, and the sight of expanding cemeteries are turning into a wave of anger, a civil mutiny that the regime cannot control. The war is theirs, the blood is ours. This is the new slogan whispered in Siberia. And this slogan is beginning to shake the foundations of the Kremlin. To understand the origins of this tragedy, we must understand that Russia has functioned not as a modern nation-state, but as a ruthless internal colonial empire. For centuries, Moscow has built its wealth and power by exploiting Siberia's vast natural resources and human potential. For the Kremlin, Siberia has always been nothing more than a raw material depot and strategic depth, never an equal partner. This model reached its peak with industrial ruthlessness during the Soviet era and has now been revived in Putin's Russia, this time in a military form. Putin's partial mobilization in 2022 was the bloodiest manifestation of this exploitation mechanism. It was never partial, it was an extremely selective and targeted operation. While Putin protected the children of Moscow's elite, he sent the children of Siberian mothers to the front lines. Their children could not be shielded from war by being placed in universities or government positions like the children of Moscow and St. Petersburg's elite. Their only option was to join the army and sacrifice their lives to Putin's war machine for a few thousand rubles. That is why mobilization officers targeted these poor and remote regions directly, rather than hunting in city centers or wealthier areas. In 2022, at least 9,000 people from Siberia were sent as soldiers to Russia's war in Ukraine. Although this figure is officially recorded, it is unknown how many more people from these regions were drafted into the army in subsequent years. However, what is truly striking is not the number, but how and for what purpose these people were sent to the front lines. This is because the vast majority of these people were not volunteers. They were citizens who were forced to join the army by Kremlin decrees, pressure from local officials and, in most cases, desperate living conditions. The Putin regime sent people from these distant and voiceless regions to the front lines. Soldiers from regions such as Buryatia, Tuva and Irkutsk were used as human shields in high-casualty attacks, known as human waves, against Ukraine's well-fortified defense lines. Not only weapons, but their bodies too became consumables of war. The evidence is now too clear and undeniable. The first evidence is disproportionate losses. Meticulous work conducted jointly by the independent Russian media outlet Mediazona and the BBC, documenting losses one by one through obituaries and local news reports, reveals a horrific truth. Regions such as Buryatia and Tuva suffered dozens of times more military casualties than Moscow relative to their populations. Analyses by think tanks such as the Jamestown Foundation show that this disproportion is not coincidental, but rather the result of a deliberate policy. Soldiers from these regions were sent to the front lines in the most dangerous meat grinder assaults, known as suicide missions. They were expendable pawns for the Kremlin. So far, it has been confirmed that at least 1,178 men from Irkutsk and Buryatia have died. 567 from Irkutsk and 611 from Buryatia. These figures mean that 1 in 9 men mobilized from Irkutsk and 1 in 7 from Buryatia did not return. According to an unofficial but widely accepted ratio in the field, it is assumed that for every death, there are at least 2 seriously wounded. Based on this calculation, more than 2,000 people from these two regions alone were disabled on the battlefield. These individuals were people who lost limbs, suffered severe burns, were paralyzed by spinal cord injuries, or lived with mental trauma due to the psychological devastation of war. Thus, approximately one-third of those mobilized from Irkutsk and Buryatia alone were either killed or left unable to ever live a normal life again. The second piece of evidence is the exploitation of economic desperation. Why were these regions such easy prey for the Kremlin? The answer lies in economic desperation. Republics such as Buryatia, Tuva, and Dagestan are among the poorest regions in Russia. High unemployment rates and a bleak economic outlook were ruthlessly exploited by the Kremlin. Young men were left with no economic alternative but to join the army and die in Ukraine. Contract military service was marketed to them as an escape ticket from poverty. However, it soon became clear that this ticket was one way. The third piece of evidence is abandonment by the state. The most cruel aspect of this tragedy is that the betrayal does not end at the front. Wounded soldiers returning from the front or the families of those who lost their lives are unable to receive the generous compensation and social support promised by the state. Bureaucratic obstacles, corruption, and simple neglect leave these families to their fate. Siberian communities, having lost both their children and their future, have been completely and ruthlessly abandoned by the state they believed they served. This is Putin's ethnic cleansing machine. The Kremlin is financing the war with Siberian blood and, in the process, systematically destroying Russia's ethnic diversity. Siberia's demographic future and cultural fabric are being deliberately wiped out by the Kremlin. The bloodiest period for conscripted soldiers in Siberia occurred during the Battle of Bakhmut in February 2023. 84 soldiers from Irkutsk and Buryatia lost their lives in a single operation. The picture was even bleaker for those wounded on the battlefield. Even seriously wounded soldiers were treated with only minimal interventions to keep them alive, without receiving full medical care, and were soon sent back to the front lines, to the brink of death. This was not treatment, but the logic of reusability. The human body was seen as a spare part in the Kremlin's war machine. For some, the brutality of war extended beyond the battlefield. Reports of pressure from military authorities, suicide, and abuse, practices that violated human dignity, were on the rise. There were not many options for Siberians. For those who wanted to escape the horrors of the front or surrender, the consequences were severe. Desertion or accusations of treason within Russia meant long prison sentences, forced return to the front, and systematic punishment of families. This ruthless system was tearing apart not just individuals, but the entire social fabric. By 2025, at least 399 women in Irkutsk and Buryatia had been widowed, and 828 children had been forced to grow up without fathers. These figures were not just dry statistics, they were a bloody balance sheet of families being wiped out one by one, hearths being extinguished, and futures being stolen. Poverty was becoming a fate, and there was nothing left to fill the void left by the lost male population. The war swallowed up hundreds of thousands of young men, completely destroying Siberia's already fragile demographic structure and economic future. This is a slow but unstoppable collapse. It is turning the entire region into a black hole with a domino effect. The first domino effect is demographic Armageddon. The loss of hundreds of thousands of men in their most productive years is creating an irreversible demographic wound in Siberia. This is not only a loss for today, but also a loss for unborn generations. A generation sent to the front or fleeing the country to avoid conscription cannot start families. This situation pushes already negative birth rates into a demographic death spiral. Experts warn that if the loss of the 18 to 35 male population in these regions exceeds 15%, Siberia's economic and demographic recovery will take at least 2 generations. The war is drying up Siberia, which is not the heart of Russia, but its soul and future. The second domino effect is the collapse of the workforce. The direct result of this demographic disaster is economic strangulation. Siberia's economy relies on heavy industries such as mining, agriculture, construction, and lumber. These sectors require a young and physically strong male workforce. The loss of hundreds of thousands of men is creating a massive labor shortage in these key industries. Factories cannot find workers, mines are reducing capacity, and fields are left uncultivated. The region's economic engine is being halted. The third domino effect is abandoned lands and ghost towns. Villages and towns that have lost their young population are turning into ghost towns one by one. Schools are closing, shops are shutting down, leaving only the elderly and women widowed by war behind. This is not just an economic problem, but also an existential threat. Russia's ability to control its vast territories depends on the people living there. While Putin dreams of gaining new territories in Ukraine, he is emptying Siberia, the heart of his own country. He is gaining land but losing people. This is an empire eating itself from within. He leaves behind a chaos of empty, barren lands with no one left to govern. If the loss of the male population, aged 18 to 35 in these regions, exceeds 15%, Siberia's economic recovery would take at least 2 generations. While Moscow dreamed of gaining new lands in Ukraine, it failed to realize that it was hollowing out Siberia, the heart of its own country. All of this was wearing down the patience of the Siberian people. The first and strongest voice of this anger came from the wives and mothers of soldiers. They were the opponents the regime least expected, was least prepared for, and feared the most, because it was impossible to label them Western agents or traitors. They were the mothers of the soldiers whom the regime itself called heroes. They were the homeland itself. These women's rebellion did not begin as an organized political movement. It began when a mother, driven by the helplessness of not hearing from her son, knocked on the door of the local military registration office. Soon, dozens, then hundreds of women who shared the same pain joined them. In the closed groups they created on social media, they shared information, eased their pain, and most importantly, realized they were not alone. These small networks of solidarity gradually turned into small but extremely effective protests. They did not chant slogans like, "Putin resign," as they did in Moscow. Their actions were much simpler, much more personal, and therefore much more touching. They held only photos of their missing sons, or unfurled small banners bearing only the date they were sent to the front. Their demand was not for regime change, but a profoundly human question. Where are our children? Bring them home. However, the regime's response to even this most innocent demand was brutal violence. 11 Oman riot police officers, armored, helmeted, and baton-wielding, stood in front of a mother asking about her son's fate. This disproportionate show of force was the clearest proof of how afraid the regime was, and how alienated it had become from the suffering of its own people. Putin thought Siberia would remain silent and loyal. But there is nothing more dangerous than a mother's grief and the courage it breeds. These small protests, started by mothers, are an uncontrollable grassroots movement that is slowly but surely eroding the seemingly solid ground beneath the regime's apparatus of repression. So, can this deep and justified anger ignite an open flame of rebellion in Siberia's frozen lands? The short answer to this question is, yes, it can. However, this does not mean that tanks will roll through the streets of Ulan-Ude or Irkutsk tomorrow morning, or that Siberia will declare its independence. In a modern authoritarian regime, especially in a state with a vast geography and a ruthless security apparatus like Russia, rebellion usually does not begin as we might expect. Real rebellion may begin much more quietly, much more deeply, and perhaps in the way the Kremlin fears most, with the system slowly crippling itself. This is not the anatomy of a revolution, but of a collapse. First, it is important to understand why a mass, organized armed uprising in Siberia is extremely difficult in the near term. The Kremlin has spent decades building a massive apparatus of repression to prevent such a scenario. Siberia is a vast geography with an extremely dispersed population. Organizing a coordinated and centralized insurrectionary movement between cities and towns that are thousands of kilometers apart, with different ethnic origins and local dynamics, is a logistical nightmare. One of Moscow's greatest advantages is its ability to keep its opposition geographically divided and isolated. The Kremlin's greatest assurance is its absolute monopoly on violence. The FSB is an internal intelligence army that has infiltrated the deepest capillaries of society, with the capacity to instantly detect and suppress any whisper of dissent. Rosgvardia, meanwhile, is a massive internal security force of 400,000, heavily armed and loyal directly to Putin, created precisely to suppress such internal uprisings. Any local armed insurrection attempt will be crushed within hours by overwhelming force and ruthlessly. The current discontent is largely scattered and leaderless. The anger of soldiers' mothers, the desperation of economically oppressed workers, and the demands of ethnic nationalists have not yet coalesced around a common political program and charismatic leader. For an uprising to succeed, it requires not only anger, but also a vision and the organization to carry that vision forward. This does not yet exist in Siberia. Despite all the exploitation, the economies of Siberia's regions are still largely dependent on federal subsidies, salary payments, and public projects coming from Moscow. Completely severing ties with the center could mean immediate economic collapse. This is one of the most important factors preventing many local elites from launching an open rebellion against Moscow. However, despite all these obstacles, the fire beneath the cauldron of discontent in Siberia is growing hotter by the day, and certain sparks could cause this cauldron to boil over. So, what can Vladimir Putin do in this situation? Putin's first and most instinctive response to this kind of internal threat is always an iron fist. For him, the protests of military mothers in Siberia or local ethnic discontent are not social problems to be solved, but security threats to be eradicated. Therefore, in the coming period, we will see the start of a targeted pressure and suppression operation on an unprecedented scale in eastern Russia. However, this will not be mass and indiscriminate repression like in 2022. This will be a much more surgical and sophisticated operation. Special units of the FSB will identify the leaders of these grassroots movements, the most active voices, one by one. Women who organize soldiers' mothers' associations, veterans who share the most on social media, activists defending local ethnic rights. All of them will be arrested one by one in the middle of the night, with their doors broken down on fabricated charges such as foreign agent, provocateur, or terrorist supporter. The goal is to leave the movements leaderless and paralyze everyone else with fear by sending the message, "You could be next." At the same time, a massive information blackout will be imposed in the region. And finally, brute force will take center stage. The most ruthless units of the Rosgvardia will amass in the capitals of the most troubled regions, such as Buryatia and Tuva, under the pretext of counter-terrorism exercises. Armored vehicles patrolling city streets will not only be a security measure, but also a psychological pressure tactic against the public, a constant reminder of the regime's iron fist. However, Putin is an experienced leader who knows he cannot rule by brute force alone. Repression may suppress rebellion for a time, but it does not eliminate the causes that gave rise to that rebellion. That is why the iron fist approach is always accompanied by a massive propaganda and manipulation campaign. The goal is to rewrite the narrative and redirect the people's anger away from the regime and toward new, easier targets. If that is not enough, Putin will resort to one of his most classic tactics, creating scapegoats within the country. To appease public anger, some powerful but expendable pawns of the system will be sacrificed. At the same time, the propaganda machine will attempt to construct a new narrative of heroism. Stories of soldiers, especially those from Siberian ethnic minorities who have been decorated in battle, will be exaggerated and broadcast on state television. Fear and propaganda can slow down a rebellion, but they cannot convince an empty stomach and a freezing home. Therefore, the third and most fragile pillar of Putin's crisis management strategy is economic bribery. To quell the anger in Siberia, the Kremlin will pursue a targeted hush money policy for the region. This will likely be announced with a flashy name like Special Support Package for Hero Families in Siberia. Families of soldiers killed or wounded in the war may receive one-time compensation payments above the norm. Pensioners in these regions may receive a small but symbolic raise. To encourage young people to join the army, new contracts with higher salaries specific to the region could be offered. However, this strategy has a fatal flaw. The Russian state coffers are now empty. The massive budget deficit created by the war, sanctions, and falling energy revenues make it impossible for the Kremlin to distribute money as generously as before. Every ruble promised to Siberia must either be cut from another social program or created by printing money, which further fuels inflation. Therefore, these economic carrots will most likely either fall short or turn into empty promises that cannot be fulfilled. And an unfulfilled promise deepens the feeling of betrayal rather than appeasing the people's anger. None of these strategies eliminate the main cause of the crisis, the bloody, senseless, and endless war in Ukraine. As long as the war continues, coffins will keep coming from Siberia. As long as the war continues, the Russian economy will continue to bleed and the people will continue to become poorer. And as long as the war continues, the silent rebellion in the hearts of the people will continue to smolder, waiting for the right moment for new and more powerful explosions. Putin is not putting out the fire. He is merely trying to keep the lid on a pressure cooker whose pressure is increasing day by day. And history has shown us time and again that those pressure cookers eventually explode. Thank you for choosing us.